Okay, now let's continue with capital allowance. Okay, so this capital allowance discuss on how you can actually calculate for the capital allowance. Okay, so based on our exercise before, so that one you are being given with the capital allowance, the total of the capital allowance. But for this topic, we are going to learn on how we actually calculate for that capital allowance. Okay, so if you still remember the capital allowance, we actually deducted after the adjusted income. But before that, we add with the balancing charge. If the company have the balancing charge, then you minus capital allowance. Okay, whereby it's inclusive of unabsorbed capital allowance brought forward, current year capital allowance, and if let's say the company has balancing allowance, you also need to deduct that. Then you will have statutory income. Okay, so before we discuss further regarding this capital allowance, let's look at your accounting perspective lah, so that you can get some idea about this capital allowance. I believe that I did touch on this before. Okay, so this one is just like a revision for you. Okay, so when we look at the accounting perspective, okay, when the company acquire the fixed asset, okay, it could be the long-term asset, then the company need to record that in their financial statement. Okay, so when the company wanted to record the asset that the company acquired, they need to know how much the value for that asset, because they want to record in the financial statement. So this is where we call that as initial recognition. Okay, and then once you have the asset, the company also need to do subsequent measurement, whereby they also need to calculate for the depreciation. Okay, so for the depreciation, do you still remember what are the methods that we have in order to calculate for the depreciation class? Ingat tak? This one revision je lah. You nak calculate depreciation, you guna which method? Ada few methods kan? Apa methods available?
Straight line method.
Straight line method.
Lagi?
Reducing balance.
Reducing balance method.
Balance method, yes, correct. Last one? Ingat tak? Units of production. Okay, so that's basically accounting perspective, depreciation. Okay, so this is where we have depreciation. Okay. Okay, so then when you wanted to know the net book value, initial recognition, which is the cost of the asset, you need to minus the depreciation, then you have your net book value. Okay, so in the case where the company wanted to sell the asset, we will have the disposal price. Okay, so the value, let's say the company wanted to sell the asset to the third party, so the third party need to pay the company. Okay, so then the value received is considered as disposal price. Okay, and then when you compare with the net book value, then you will have gain or loss on disposal. If let's say the net book value is more than the disposal price, that one is loss on disposal or gain class? Net book value more than disposal price?
Loss.
Loss, okay. So if let's say the net book value is less than disposal price, that one is gain. Okay, so that's in the accounting perspective. Okay, so for the taxation perspective, you can just relate with the accounting. Okay, so for the taxation perspective, we have qualifying plan expenditure. Okay, so this qualifying plan expenditure is actually the cost for that asset. Okay, so how we determine the qualifying plan expenditure, we are going to discuss later. Okay, the details. How we determine is quite different from the accounting lah. Okay, but it's basically the same term with the initial recognition. Okay, so this one is qualifying plan expenditure, or short form QPE. Okay, so when I say QPE, it's referring to the qualifying plan expenditure. So usually this one is based on the price that the company paid, and then if the company incurred installation costs and some other things that they need to pay, so that one also may be part of the QPE. Okay, so we are going to discuss in detail after this. All right, if we still have time lah. Okay, so then again, just like accounting, they have depreciation. For the taxation perspective, we have capital allowance. So yang ni lah yang kita nak kira on our own. Okay, so whereby for the capital allowance, we have initial allowance and also annual allowance. So if you total up these two, then it will make up the capital allowance for the year. Okay, so initial allowance, as the word suggests, the company can only claim the initial allowance for the asset when the company first acquired the asset. Okay, for example, the company acquired the asset in 2021. So means that in 2021, the company can claim their initial allowance. Okay, next year tak boleh dah lah. Means that only this year, which is when the company first acquire the asset. Okay, so usually the rate is 20%. Okay, so for the capital allowance, we are actually using the straight line basis. Okay, because we take the percentage. Okay, so initial allowance for all the types of asset, it is 20%. Okay, so let's say your QPE is 100,000 ringgit, then 20% from 100,000 ringgit, the company can get that as initial allowance. Okay, so that's for initial allowance. The detail again, we are going to discuss later. Annual allowance is actually the allowance that the company can claim every year. Okay, so the rate is different, depends on the types of asset that the company have. It could be 10%, it could be 15%, or it could be 20%. Okay, so that one is annual allowance, but the company can only claim for the annual allowance up to the amount of the qualifying plan expenditure. So for example, let's say here, the qualifying plan expenditure for the asset is 100,000. So it means that the company can claim for the annual allowance up to 4 years only. Okay, because they claim for initial allowance, not for 4 years. Okay, let's say the annual allowance is 20%. Okay, again, depending on your types of asset lah. Okay, because annual allowance is, the rate is different. Okay, let's say the annual allowance for that asset is 20%, means that the company can claim for the capital allowance up to 4 years je lah. Okay, because they claim for initial allowance 20%, annual allowance 20% for first year. Okay, second year they claim for another 20%, third year they claim for another 20%, the last year they claim for 20%. Kalau dia tak jual, okay, if let's say they don't sell the asset, okay, so means that they can claim up to year 4, okay, because 20 plus 20 plus, it is actually basically 100%. Okay, so that's regarding annual allowance. Residual expenditure is just like your net book value here. Qualifying plan expenditure, you need to minus initial allowance and also annual allowance that the company claim during the year. Okay, so then you will have your residual expenditure. So this one macam you need to minus accumulated initial allowance and annual allowance. Just like your depreciation, when you want to know your net book value, the cost here you need to minus the accumulated depreciation, then you will have net book value. Okay, same goes to this one. When you wanted to know the residual expenditure for that asset, the qualifying plan expenditure, you need to minus initial allowance and also annual allowance that the company already claimed. Okay, so then you will know how much the residual expenditure. Okay, sometimes this one also known as tax written down value. So kalau dalam exam, biasanya in our discussion, we use residual expenditure. So in exam, if let's say suddenly you see the term tax written down value, it's also referring to the residual expenditure. So don't get confused. Okay, so then just like this one, accounting perspective, we have disposal value. Okay, so this one happened when the company wanted to sell the asset to the third party. Okay, so then we have disposal value. Okay, so disposal value, sometimes the calculation is a bit different, especially when there is a restriction. Okay, so later we are going to discuss in detail. Okay, so then we have balancing charge or balancing allowance. Okay, again, balancing charge is actually referring to the gain. Okay, balancing allowance is referring to the loss. Okay, the concept is just like this one. So it means that if let's say the residual expenditure is is more than the disposal value, so that one is considered as balancing allowance. But if let's say the residual expenditure is less than the disposal value, or it means that disposal value is more than the residual expenditure, then this one is considered as balancing charge. Okay, so that's why balancing charge you must add when you want to calculate your tax, and then balancing allowance you minus, because this one is considered as loss, this one is considered as gain. Okay, so that's the concept of capital allowance. Okay, so these are the things that you need to know. You need to know what is QPE, how you determine the QPE, and then how you calculate for the initial allowance and also annual allowance, when the company can actually claim for this one. All right, and then you also need to know how you calculate for your residual expenditure, disposal value, balancing charge, and balancing allowance. On top of this, you also need to know about the restriction. Okay, restriction. So this restriction is actually applies for the motor vehicles. Okay, so if you still remember when we learned about business expenses, we have lease rental, we have restriction. So that one also applies for this capital allowance. So later we are going to discuss in detail. And then we also have small value asset. Okay, small value asset. What are the treatment for this small value asset? Okay, so when the company acquire the small value asset, how the company can actually claim for their capital allowance is a little bit different from what we have discussed here. And then another thing that you need to know is that how you calculate the capital allowance if the company acquire the asset by cash, and then how you calculate for your capital allowance if the company acquire the asset by hire purchase. How you calculate for these two is different. If the company acquired the asset by cash, that one is easier. Okay, but if the company acquired the asset through hire purchase, that one is a bit complicated compared to when they obtain the asset using cash. Okay, so now let's go back to this one. Any question regarding this concept? Soalan tak? Before we look at the one by one, the details. We are going to look at KPE, capital allowance and so on. Ada soalan tak? Hopefully you understand the concept lah. Okay. Kalau tak ada soalan, kita continue with this one. Okay, so we continue with 2.0, qualifying plant expenditure. Okay, so QPE is capital expenditure incurred on the provision of machinery or plant used for the purposes of business. Okay, so you can only claim for the capital allowance if you acquire the asset to use in the business. Okay, so then you can claim for the capital allowance. Okay, so how you determine the QPE is, okay, so this one is actually will help you to calculate for the QPE. Okay, it includes among others, first one, expenditure incurred on the alteration of an existing building for the purpose of installing that machinery or plant and other expenditure incurred incidentally to the installation thereof. Okay, so this one, if let's say the company want to purchase an asset, let's say the machine. Okay, so the cost for the machine is part of the KPE. Okay, on top of that, if let's say the company need to do the installation, the installation cost to install that machine, the cost also will considered as part of the qualifying plant expenditure. Okay, so means that cost plus with the installation cost. Okay, so that's for number one. So number two, expenditure incurred on preparing, cutting, tunneling or leveling land. Okay, so this one you must look at this term. Okay, PCTL, okay, preparing, cutting, tunneling or leveling land in order to prepare a site for installation, okay, for of that machinery or plant. But if the expenditure exceeds 10% of the aggregate of itself and any other expenditure incurred for the purposes of the business, this subparagraph shall not apply. Okay, so generally, if the company incurred the expenses to prepare the site for the installation, so this one is the installation, okay, this one is the company prepare the site for the installation. The company can consider that as part of KPE as long as the cost incurred here does not exceed 10% of the aggregate of that asset. Aggregate of that asset means that the cost, the price, plus the installation cost, if any, plus the expenditure that the company incurred here. Okay, so if let's say the expenditure that the company incurred here does not exceed 10% from that total, then the company can consider this expenses as part of the qualifying plant expenditure. Okay, so later we are going to look at the details, the example. Okay, and then number three, if the company incurred expenditure on fish ponds, animal pens, chicken houses, cages, buildings, other than those used wholly or partly for the living accommodation of a director, an individual having control of that business, or an individual who is a member of the management, admin or clerical staff engaged in the business, and other structural improvements on land which are used for the purposes of poultry farms, animal farms, inland fishing industry, or other agricultural or pastoral pursuits. Okay, so number three is actually specific to the agricultural business. Okay, so if this company or this business incur these expenses, then it's also part of the QPE. Okay, so we rarely lah kita test student for the agriculture business. Okay, so generally how you determine the qualifying funds expenditure is the cost that you incur to purchase the machine or plant to be used in the business, plus the installation cost, okay, and then also the cost that you incur to prepare the site for the installation, okay. And also this one, if let's say you are actually have the agriculture business. Okay, so for this one, I give you example. Okay, for example, let's say the company purchase a crane. Okay, so in order to install the crane, let's say they need to do something at their land. Okay, so that is basically the expenditure incurred. So if let's say the expenditure incurred is actually more than 10%, then they cannot consider that expenses as part of the KPE. Okay, so let's look at this example. Not this example. Okay, so let's look at this example 18.2. Okay, so this example you can read on your own. Itulah. Okay, example 18.2. Terilin Sdn Bhd, a company manufacturing boxes, acquired the following assets during its financial year ended 30th June 2021. Okay, so now they purchased the printing machine. Okay, whereby the cost of the machine is 280,000. And then cost of alteration to the existing building for the installation of the machine is 33,600, and the incidental cost of installation is 2,400. Okay, so if you want to determine the QPE for this printing machine, the one we need to consider is 280,000, which is the cost, and then cost of alteration to the existing building for the installation, which is 33,600, as well as the cost of installation, which is 2,400. So that would be the total of QPE. Okay, because for the costing of machine, we know that there is a cost. Okay, so that one is referring to the provision of machinery here. Okay, and then for the cost that the company incurred, which is for this one, 33,600 and also 2,400, is actually falls under this category, which is alteration of an existing building for installation of plant or machinery. Okay, so that's for A. Okay, so for B, when the company acquired the cutting machine, okay, capital expenditure incurred on the cost of machine is 62,000 ringgit. Cost of preparing the site for the installation of the machine is 8,000 ringgit. Okay, so you must look at the word preparing the site for the installation is 8,000 ringgit. Okay, so all two machines were in use for the purpose of the business at the end of the financial year ended 30th June 2021. Okay, so for this machine, the company use for the business, so then they can claim for the capital allowance. Okay, so for B here, when you want to determine the capital allowance, when you want to determine for QPE, the one that you need to consider is 62,000. And then for this one, you need to test whether is it exceed than 10% of the aggregate amount or not. Okay, so how you determine that is 62,000 you plus with 8,000, which is the cost incurred for the preparing the site for the installation. Okay, so the total is 70,000. Okay, so now you must calculate 10% from 70,000. Kalau you calculate 10% from 70,000, berapa you dapat? Kelas?
7,000.
7,000. Okay, so if you compare 7,000 and also 8,000, yang mana lebih tinggi?
8,000.
8,000. So it means that the expenditure that the company incur here is already exceed 10% of the aggregate expenses that we have here. Okay, so it means that this one cannot consider as QPE. So it means that the QPE for this cutting machine is only 62,000. Faham tak, kelas? Hopefully you understand lah. Okay. So but if let's say we took another example. Okay, let's say the cost of machine is 62,000. Okay, and then the company actually incurred the cost 6,500. Okay, so let's say the cost of site preparation for installation is only 5,000 ringgit. Okay, so now the total is 67,000. Kalau you kira 10% from the 67,000, dapat berapa?
6,700.
6,700. Okay, so now is it this figure that the company incurred, is it exceed 10% of the amount?
No.
No. Okay, so when it's not exceed 10% of the aggregate amount, the QPE for this asset in this example is 67,000. Okay, because you can consider this 5,000 as part of the QPE. Okay, understand? Okay, hopefully you understand that. Okay, so we have the definition of plant here, apparatus, all of this. Hopefully you can read this one on your own. Okay, so please read this one on your own. Okay, so it's already 9:48. Okay, so for the next class, okay, so this one we already discussed earlier on. So you can read this one on your own. Kita dah discuss. Okay, so the next class we are going to continue with initial allowance here. Okay. So again, for the previous part, you need to read on your own. Okay, so next we are going to continue how we calculate for the initial allowance. Okay, any question before we end the session? Okay, class, for our quiz, third quiz, inshallah we are going to do it next week, but not during the class because I don't think that we have enough time to cover the topic because we have capital allowance as well as partnership. Partnership is quite short, but for the capital allowance is quite long. Okay, so we are going to have the quiz not during the class. Okay, so it should be next week. So next week we will be our final week, last week for this semester. Okay, any question, class? Okay, no question. So we end the session with Tasbih Kifarah and Suratul As.